agenda tonight.
Track the time before you- Sure, we appreciate you showing.
Okay, we'll
Up on the internet to check.
we'll call the meeting to order. So we'll start with the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge of
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Amen.
Okay, roll call. Mr. Hall.
Here.
Mr. Hoag notified us that he couldn't be here tonight. That's what I heard. Mr. Merlington.
Called them, no response.
Okay, we're not sure about Mr. Burlington, but not here. Ms. Naparowski.
Here.
Mr. Nixon
Here.
and Mr. Conley is here. Excuse me. We have the city manager, Mr. Womack, Mr. Moore, the city planner, and Ms. Johnson, the city clerk here tonight. We have meeting minutes from our last regular meeting on April 12th, 2022 that we should look over and see if we can approve those. Anyone have anything on last meeting's minutes that we need to look at? Hearing none, can I get a motion to approve last meeting's minutes?
I'll make the motion to approve the last meeting minutes.
You. Second? Or, thank you. Any discussion? Okay, please reply with aye to approve the minutes. Or, well, thank you. I'm tongue-tied tonight. Sorry about that.
You're okay.
All opposed? Motion carries. The minutes are approved. Tonight's agenda. Need a motion to approve tonight's agenda.
So move.
Second.
Anything we need to address on the agenda, or does it look good? All in favor of approving tonight's agenda, please signify with aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? And the motion carries. Okay, public comments. Those citizens wishing to speak on agenda and non-agenda items will be allowed a maximum of 4 minutes each to address their concerns. This is the only time during the meeting that citizens are allowed to address the planning commission. Please state your name and address for the record if you would like. Do you have any public comments in the room tonight? Or on the internet? Hearing none. We'll move on to item 7. This is our opportunity with item 7, conflicts of interest and ex parte communication inquiry. This is your opportunity, planning commission members, to reveal if either of the above has happened in the last month. Hearing none, we'll move on to number 8, scheduled public hearings. Item A, a public hearing for an ordinance to amend chapter 32, article 8, section 32696, uses C through E, subpart B, churches of the code of ordinances for the city of Cedar Springs. Proposed ordinance reduces the required lot size and amends parking requirements for the churches, for churches. Mr. Womack, is there anything, or Mr. Moore, is there anything that we should be looking at here?
I do have one note. I'm just scrolling to find it here. So this is just something that came up in between writing the ordinance and yesterday when I thought of it. So the only change that I would recommend from the draft is in subpart 5, that we may wish to insert some language which would require that there be a continuous 5-foot wide ADA compliant sidewalk from any off-site parking locations to the actual church location. I would simply hate for a church to arrange for off-site parking, have the planning commission approve of that off-site parking, and then have the church attendees be forced to walk in the street or through somebody's front yard to go between the parking area and the church. Place of worship, I should say. So that would be a recommendation that we insert that language into subpart 5.
You. Then I'm going to open up the public hearing. If there's any comment or anything anyone would like to let us know about that, feel free to come on up and do so.
Craig Owens, 355 Ronald Street. I just want to thank you guys. I know this sometimes gets a little tedious going through all of these ordinances, and but I think that you guys looking at things and making sure that they fit and make everything harmonious in our communities is very important. So, and I think that these changes are going to be well suited for our community. So thanks for your work on that.
Thank you. Any other, anyone else who would like to speak for the public hearing, either here or online? Not hearing anyone else, we'll close the public hearing. And at this point, I suppose we need to address, you want a motion to actually recommend this to the city before we, or to the city council before we move on.
Yep. But I would ask that you guys at least discuss the
Right.
sidewalk issue. And then you guys can make a recommendation either with or without that proposed change.
Okay, so this is on page, I'm on the wrong thing here.
Be page 11, second part of the ordinance anyway.
Okay,
Where did you say that was?
So under subpart 5,
Yeah.
it discusses off-site parking. In anticipation of, obviously in this town, you can't always have as much parking as you might like on location. So if the planning commission might wish to allow a place of worship to have an off-site parking lot, I'd like to see a continuous 5-foot sidewalk that's ADA compliant
Okay.
between the two locations.
Between
So
the
that
two.
people aren't walking in the street, they're not walking in somebody's front yard to get between the two locations.
so, and then you have language that we could insert into that from what you just, or is it, or you just want us to kind of,
Yeah, so my note here says we may wish to insert some language about requiring that there exists a continuous 5-foot wide ADA compliant sidewalk from the off-site parking location to the actual church location. Obviously, church would be a place of worship or something.
so if we were to, for instance, make a motion and approve it, that we would approve this with that additional requirement, then the actual language could be changed before it goes to the city council to reflect that.
Suppose so.
I mean, I guess what I'm saying is, not sure I feel comfortable in stating the exact language that goes into ordinance on the fly. But I can state, but I feel comfortable that the planning commission could state the intent.
Sure. I mean, it wouldn't be the first time we've done that. Obviously, I want you guys to feel comfortable with the language that's being proposed because it's your recommendation. Obviously. If you just give me a minute, maybe I can formulate some exact language.
Okay,
So there are other aspects of the ordinance.
sure. Is there anything else about?
Mr. Moore has his recommendation. If you.
Oh, okay.
So, I would suggest a continuous 5-foot wide ADA compliant sidewalk shall be constructed that connects an improved off-site parking area to the place of worship to which it connects.
Insert that to subpart
I
5 or
would
create
just
a new.
tack it right onto the end.
Now, to which it connects.
Yeah, we could probably just say to the place of worship.
Well, I was gonna say, make it more clear that because they may have off-site parking that is not connected to the actual building. Because what if they have a building and then something else there and then off-site parking? So then how would they? I have seen that, so how would they do that?
I think I might need more clarification of what you mean, because what I'm talking about is you've got a parking lot that's a block away.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, yes.
And you need sidewalk from that location to the location of the place of worship.
So how do you get the sidewalk through other means because you don't own all that property in between there.
Well, so what I would envision is the city has the right away, the road right away. And we can especially assess properties for sidewalks, but if we're talking about a place of worship that needs off-site parking, they would then volunteer to pay for the installation of that sidewalk if they wanted to use the off-site parking.
I just, okay.
I think it's probably similar in concept to a school putting up a new building and they want to run sidewalk to it, and it has to cross private property to do that, but the school might volunteer to pay for that because it's part of connecting their two school buildings.
So what concerns me is the property owners, do they have a say in saying, no, you can't do? Thank you. That's what concerns me.
Not so long as the city has a right of way.
Thank you. That's what concerned me. Thank you.
Mr. Hall?
What about off-street parking? If they're parking along the street and walking to and from, would that be required?
Yep, so here's the language I have in specific.
That's where I see a dilemma.
On-street parking is not permitted for such use. I'm sorry, did you mean on the street parking?
Yes.
So on-street parking is not permitted for such use unless on-street parking is marked for such use by the general public in that district. In other words, along the side streets abutting Main Street,
Mhm.
those are painted on-street parking spaces.
Okay.
On the other hand, in the residential neighborhoods,
Right.
those are not painted parking spaces. So at least the way I envisioned it, you would not be able to say, well, I have a place of worship and now you can line the street on both sides in a residential neighborhood.
Well, I could see it'd be problematic where people, they're gonna park there.
Well, and
And
then,
ultimately, the resident, or the place of worship would be responsible to put ADA sidewalks in from wherever they parked
yes,
to walk to the site.
If-
On off street. You see what I'm saying? It depending on who interpretates this thing. That's where I'm coming at.
are you saying,
Right now, you interpret it this way.
yeah, sure,
5 years from now, we get another guy in there and says, hey, these people had to put an ADA sidewalk in because people are parking off street
Off street or on street?
or on the street.
Because this is, we were talking about if they have
To
a
a
separate
connector.
parking lot.
This would be a connector from a parking lot.
Right, so not parking on the street, but parking off the street on a separate parking lot that the
Just
police and workers
saying.
wanted.
well, and I get your point, I understand what you're saying. But I guess my philosophy is if the parking exists for the general public and is marked as such, you
Yeah.
can't stop somebody from parking there, whether they're going to the church or not.
Right.
But you can't just willy-nilly park wherever you want either.
No, it's supposed to.
Contrary to the city's other ordinances that we have about parking.
No. You're
So
not.
I'm just saying, okay, so you have a church or a place of worship and they don't have, enough space on site for their parking lot.
Yeah.
We're still gonna hold them to the parking requirements,
Mhm.
but they could have a parking space a block away.
That's fine. And that covers that.
So
I'm
they have a
just.
sidewalk between those two locations.
Okay.
Right.
But if they're, say, on Main Street, some building on Main Street,
Mhm.
now all those on-street parking spaces, which are painted and marked and
Yes.
usable by the general public, I
Have
don't
to
see why
be-
they couldn't just park there.
And they have to be ADA.
Well, but I don't think that's part of the requirement here because the city's public streets
Mhm.
and sidewalks are ADA.
Right.
So I don't see how we should or could require that additional requirement for just generalized public parking.
Just to clarify things.
Did you want to hear the language a second time, just to make sure that, because there was
Sure.
some.
Sure,
clarification.
absolutely.
Yeah,
Please.
adjusting this on the fly here, so
I talked long enough. You should have been able to finish that.
Hmm.
I'm there.
Yeah, I mean, especially if you don't listen to them. I mean,
Okay, so I changed it a little bit, so it says there shall be a continuous 5-foot wide ADA compliant sidewalk that connects an off-site vehicle parking area to the place of worship.
Okay.
That's come on.
That
Sure.
doesn't require them to reconstruct if it's already there. I think it's clear that it just has to connect to replace, and because some of these will have an existing sidewalk that serves them, and all we need to do is facilitate the person moving from their off-street parking area to the building without trumping through the street.
Okay.
And frankly, if someone is using that space and they're in a wheelchair or something, we'll make them. Everything else.
Yeah, I'm comfortable with that language.
Any other discussion on this or any other issues we want to look at? Okay. Then I'm assuming that Ms. Johnson, you have the language, or you would be able to have the language specifically if you didn't write it down already that he had. So if we just alluded to it, then you'd be okay with that. Okay. So I'll make the motion to recommend approval of an ordinance to amend chapter 32, article 8, section 32696, uses C3 subpart B, churches, the code of ordinances for the city of Cedar Springs, as presented to us with the amendment to item 5 as it was read by Mr. Moore. Or does it get?
I'll
support?
second it.
Okay.
Sorry, I forgot what I was doing for a second. Okay.
Any other discussion on this? Okay, all in favor, please signify with aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? Okay, the motion carries and we're recommending approval. Moving on to item 9, site plan reviews. This is a beautiful site and I just wanted I need to qualify that statement. I love the fact that there's no site plan reviews because it's going to make the meeting very quick. Although I also love having site plan reviews because, you know, it's kind of the reason, one of the reasons we're here. So, but I'll take it tonight. It's a nice night. Moving on, item 10, other business. A, discussion on sample pool ordinance. And then we have the Sparta pool ordinance that we're looking at. Is there more to this than what we've seen before? That's what I think we've seen the Sparta pool ordinance last time. Am I correct on that?
Yeah, so I hate to admit it, but a very busy month. I expected Mr. Moore to do all the work, and
I can see that.
so I'm helping him out here by adding an ordinance that I had been working off of. And then I presented the board the opportunity to compare the two to see if there were any changes that they might like to see in the recommended ordinance. So I think Mr. Moore presented the draft ordinance, which you see. And so you should have had the opportunity to compare that to the Sparta ordinance to see if there's any changes you might like to make.
I see that.
I think one of the changes I did notice, double check real quick, is that there is something in the Sparta ordinance about cross connections, which we might want to add into our ordinance. Now, we do have a separate section in our utilities ordinance, which deals with cross connections, but it might just make it simpler to add a prohibition against cross connections in this pool ordinance.
That's the necessity of an air gap. That's basically what they're referring to.
That's in the plumbing code, the state plumbing code, bowl code.
I mean, so part of the reason that we're proposing this ordinance is because the current pool ordinance for the city of Cedar Springs really doesn't address anything. It's very poorly done. And so all the time we go out and find these temporary pools which don't meet any of the safety requirements. Now, we could very easily just say, well, if you go to the pools and spas code at whatever, it says this, right? But part of what we're doing is making the actual rules, the important safety rules, easily accessible through the city's code, just to make it that much more easy for us to enforce it.
Right.
And so the public is aware of it, you know. So, Mr. Hall, I agree with you, and it is in our utilities ordinance. I'm just asking the board whether they feel that it's something they should add into this ordinance, which is a prohibition against cross connections.
mean, I think it's always nice when you're asking someone to look at an ordinance, to have them look at, you know, what, if they're looking at the swimming pool ordinance because they want to put a pool in, to see what all of the rules are related to a pool without asking to cross apply to other ordinances that might be on the books, but they might not think of. So for clarity, it's probably not a bad thing to have it in, even if it's in there twice.
And we could simply reference to
IMG.
another section of our ordinance and even just copy the same language.
Yeah, that's true.
I have a quick question. The ordinance that you presented, that's the one that you presented and you wrote up, right?
I believe this
That-
one was Mr. Moore. Yeah.
Oh,
So
okay.
if it's something negative, you blame him.
Sparta.
No, I had a question about a 4-foot high fence. Is that tall enough? Because, I mean,
So that's the minimum requirement under the code, I believe.
Yeah, so the
State.
the state construction code, which incorporates the International Pool and Spa Code, requires a minimum 4-foot high fence around the pool unless that pool is equipped with a powered safety cover that meets all the state powered safety covers. So
Hard surface.
that's, I mean, we've actually done a lot of swimming pool ordinances over the last 5 years because this powered safety cover thing has come up a bunch of times and people don't want to put fences around their pools because they have one of these. And so a lot of communities have been looking at this going, well, it says it got to have a fence, so too bad, put up a fence. And there's been some disagreement on a lot of planning commissioners about whether or not they should do that. Because obviously, powered safety cover is great, but you can just leave it open.
Mhm.
And then it's just sitting there, I guess, on the same.
Yeah.
Leave the gate open for your fence too, right?
Also,
There's
The
been
gate-
a conversation.
yeah, the gate around the fence is supposed to be self-closing and self-latching.
Right.
So
Right.
I guess you could prop it open.
Yeah.
But one question I had is if the sidewall of the pool itself, for in a ground buff pool, is more than 48 inches above the surrounding ground, I believe that is sufficient to meet that standard if the
Ladder.
ladder that goes up into the pool can be self-locked out of.
My understanding is the same.
Yeah, okay. So I don't know, would this language make it so you could have that arrangement instead of a fence?
I think so, but we could add something specifically to address that. I think that would be helpful. This, I think, primarily considers ground pools and not the above ground, right? So appropriate to add.
Swimming pool shall be enclosed by a fence or wall of the height of at least 4 feet, sufficient to make it above the wall. Such enclosure including needs, but
Have it in there.
it's 4 feet.
well, thank you, Mr. Moore. I just, when I had read that earlier, I was like, well, that seems awfully short. So that's why I was just,
Yeah, I mean, you could, I don't suppose there's anything, that would preclude you from requiring something taller than 4 feet. But
right.
in my experience, every community has gone with that 4-foot standard simply because that's coming out of the state construction.
And that's fine. If the state's
much.
okay with it, then
A standard fencing too.
So, Mr. Moore, this, which code is it that this all self-references to? Is it the Michigan Construction Code or the Michigan Pool and Spa Code?
It's the Michigan Construction Code that incorporates the international food spot.
So would it be possible to maybe reference in this, was it subpart F here, some generalized language such as, or other permitted methods under the Michigan Construction Code?
Yeah, so, well, the first sentence is, for the first predicate part is supposed to do that under,
Yep.
where it says unless a power safety cover is installed in accordance with the state construction code and any regulations that are incorporated by reference. That's what that's supposed to do, but we could more explicitly state.
I was gonna say, it says unless a powered safety. So that's referencing the safety cover, the powered safety.
Right.
cover. If we're saying the 4-foot sidewall and the lockable.
Yeah. We
different.
could say unless a power safety cover or other adequate measures.
Yeah, that's fine.
Says,
I
If
don't
they,
know.
if they don't have any, they don't have either or of those, they must be required with a 4-foot fence.
Yeah, I think most people are going to use a 4-foot fence. Although, yeah, you'd be surprised how many people just put a pool out in the middle of their backyard, with no kind of safety mechanism around it.
Well, nowadays you can buy them things for $700-800 and set them up in your backyard and they're done.
I was at Meyer the other day and it's 300 or 400.
Yep.
When it says pools used for swimming or bathing, does that include hot tubs?
I believe the language also indicates,
So that would probably wouldn't satisfy the surface area requirement. of 250 square
Too
feet.
small.
Yeah, that came up,
Right.
it came up while you were gone.
Oh, okay,
And,
okay.
and
Because I was reading
I
the
had,
Sparta
I had
one.
the exact same question.
Okay.
And I think that's why you stuck the surface area less than 250 in there.
Yeah, so I think what we'll do, so we talked at the last meeting about clarifying that a little bit. So I
Mhm.
think what we'll do here, if it's okay with you, is just take that first part out, so it just says, these regulations shall not be applicable to any less than 40 foot, kind of go from there, so taking off that first part, because that seemed to be what confused. Double funding with members that, everybody else too, so
what about the
take that
water
as well.
recirculating system though? Do hot tubs
Yeah.
normally have those?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Closed system. Not
We-
interconnected.
I mean, it's pretty much the same. My swimming pool and my hot tub have essentially the same system. It's a, it's
Yeah.
a, it's a filter. It rotates the water around. There's really no
I suspect
difference.
The reasoning there is because the suction can be dangerous under the water.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So that's why you want to have all these safety mechanisms in place. For that type of thing. Well, I mean, again, if you think about it, most people are going to have their hot tubs, pools, whatever in the backyard. And backyards are generally going to have a 4-foot wide or 4-foot tall fence around it. So
Privacy.
probably for the most part meets requirements. I also don't know if we want to, well, you can't put a pool in your front yard anyways.
Nope.
That's
Says
just
right
something
there.
out of the Zoning ordinance. So I don't think that's going to cause a lot of problems.
Don't either.
Mr. Nixon, can you envision a situation where your hot tub shouldn't have some kind of fencing around it or?
No, I want fencing around the hot tub. That's what I was saying. I was reading, when I had read in the Sparta ordinances, it had talked about hot tubs, but when I read in ours, it did not say hot tubs. All it said was swimming pools. And then when I was reading about bathing, I thought, okay, maybe that's referring. So we didn't have the wording that said hot tub in there. So then I was like, okay.
I think most hot tubs are going to be deeper than 24 inches. And I think most are going to have some kind of water recirculating system.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure, because I didn't want to like pass this and then somebody's like, oh, well, you didn't say anything about this. And
I could envision a situation where someone has their hot tub just like or something,
In the back.
and if maybe the outer, extreme limits of their backyard are fenced, but they don't have a separate fence, they might say, I don't want to put a separate fence around this little hot tub, and there might be something in that international pool and spa code that addresses that. So we can check into that a little bit more specifically. So
I think hot tubs, I think they also have lockable covers
They have a
But you
cover
can-
on them to maintain heat.
that you can actually lock them too. So there's that thing too, that you can, if you have a lock on it, if you have a lockable cover. And that way you don't have to have a fence if that cover's locked. Nobody's getting in it.
Not saying that the code writers have too much time on their hands or anything, but if you've read the International Pool and Spa Code, I think it also indicates that if your house is part of the 4-foot fence around your pool, and you have minor children in the house, you have to have all doors and windows that are accessible to your backyard with an audible alarm if the door is opened. So I'm not checking anybody's house for that.
I'll make sure I tell my 15-year-old. Hey.
Yeah.
So, sounds like we've got a couple of changes, modifications, Mr. Moore is working on at this very moment. Do you guys want to table this to another meeting to come up with more final language, or do you want to attempt to put together?
I mean, if you're in a rush, we can try to put something together, but otherwise I'm not.
I take that back. This is section 32, which is now our zoning ordinance. Require public hearing. So Yeah, let us put together a more final draft for your next hearing.
Okay.
next Meeting, and we'll have a public hearing on this.
I think it looks pretty good though so far.
So, do you want a motion to table, or you just want us to table it?
Well, right now, we're just at discussion, aren't we? So,
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought we completed discussion.
We have to make a motion that we set a public hearing for next month and bring on any modification or changes back. The final adjustment for next month.
I couldn't hear the beginning. Were you actually saying a motion or just saying?
Yes.
Okay. I second that.
Motion to set a public hearing and to bring it back with the changes. We get this thing moving. The summer's coming.
Mr. Conway, would you second that?
Any other discussion? All in favor of the motion to table this and create the public hearing, please signify with aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? Motion carries. Moving on, item B, discussion on sample industrial building facade requirements ordinance. So what's new on that?
This is definitely more up Mr. Moore's alley than mine. I can barely dress myself sometimes with colors that match. So, last time, I believe Mr. Moore and I talked about the recent building that was put in by Jade Farms and how I think the board liked the design of that. It does have some minor elements which I think kind of break up those slab sidedness you sometimes get in industrial buildings. And that was the ordinance that we had been previously working on, which I think is page 19. That's where our ordinance was. But you know, Mr. Moore has had some success working with the ordinance that he's presented, which is at page 18. And so I guess I just wanted to find out whether the board wanted to include some of the elements that we'd worked on previously, and maybe have a melding of the proposed ordinance from Mr. Moore, along with some of the requirements from our ordinance.
On page 19, is this what we're referring to with the?
Yeah, 19 going into 20. So I think we got caught up with some of the requirements about what type of materials would be permitted. Because obviously in an industrial zone, you want to kind of allow that steel facade. But, you know, that can look very slab-sided. So one of the things we talked about was having kind of a 3-foot section at the bottom where it's a different material, different color, something like that. Also, it serves a purpose of if it gets bumped by a vehicle, it's easy to kind of remove. And also that the entrance shall have, you know, I forget what the language was, but a projection and a roof over it. Some just minor things like that. Let's see. Oh, sorry, my computer's acting funny. So I'm on page 20. Okay, so page 21, subpart C. Some of this language, building entrances shall be clearly defined and recessed or framed by a sheltering element such as an awning, arcade, or portico, which provides shelter for some rain or snow. All architectural elevations of any principal buildings over 20 feet in height or any building facade that adjoins or faces a public road or right of way shall have a clearly discernible base, body, and cap. The base shall occupy the lowest portion of the elevation and should have a height of at least 3 foot. The body shall occupy the middle portion of the elevation. The cap shall occupy the highest portion of the elevation, including the roof. Cap shall consist of a cornice, parapet, awning, canopy, eave, etc. The base and cap shall be clearly distinguishable, etc., etc. So that language that you see there under subpart C, that was the language I felt was important for what you guys were looking for. But Mr. Moore's proposed ordinance under page 18 or whatever it was. It's good, simple language. He's had success with it in other locations, so I'm comfortable. He's comfortable with it using that language, but I guess my question for the board is, do you like this language? Do you want to keep this? Do you want to add this into our future industrial facade ordinance?
So when you say like this language, are you referring to what we see here from 1920 and 21?
No.
Or referring
so-
to,
Yeah, so really the ordinance from 1920 and 21 is the old ordinance, which I was trying to modify.
got it.
Which, as you guys know, was very, very complex. The important part, I think, is on page 21, subpart C. You see it's all highlighted in yellow.
Yes.
And that was the language I think that we worked on the most. That kind of creates I'll say the basic vision of what the facade should be looking like.
Mhm.
But most of the
Whole
rest of
building.
it, I thought Mr. Moore's ordinance kind of was good for the rest of it.
And that's where I want to make sure I understand which one is Mr. Moore's ordinance. I see in the packet, I see page 18, there's two sections, one from Layton Township and one from Virgin Township.
Those are the two that, those are both clients of ours that we've used. Out of these two, I'm more comfortable with the Layton Township approach. I think that seems to be a more reasonable standard, and that has given some applicants flexibility. Sometimes they just say, okay, fine, at 25%, I'll just do the bottom 4 feet of my 16-foot building. Like a, brick thing on it or something like that. If you want something that is more robust and more detailed, I think that we would look at adding some of the stuff that Mr. Womack here has put together. I do like the building entrance. Under subpart C1.
Mhm.
I like C2 as well. I think it's clear. There might be some building designs where they're looking at things that don't sort of fit that.
Well, I'm not-
This is really a policy decision for the planning commission in terms of what you want. the buildings to look like.
I was gonna say, I'm not married to that language. I mean, I agree. I do like the entrance language, but the base, the cap, the body, that was just simply trying to create a very simple, because what we don't want is pole barns. And at least that language creates 3 separate and distinct locations on the building where something has to change.
Right.
So if you're comfortable with this and you feel like we could use this ordinance to create variety, at least visual variety in these new buildings that will be coming in, I'm comfortable with whatever you're comfortable with.
I thought the way that it read was very easy to read when I read it. And I thought it made a whole lot of sense. It wasn't hard to actually read it and go, oh, well, what do I have to do here when I build a building? I have to figure this out. It's very easy to read. So when somebody looks at it, they can go, that's exactly what I have to do. And I thought it worked very well.
I think to be a little cognizant of with respect to the Virgin Township, like that it does allow for the planning commission to approve other materials, and that it has these sort of 4 standards. So developers try to take advantage of that, and if it's like a big operation or something, they'll say, well, we want to do the whole thing with just siding, and then just have this little corner where our offices will do something interesting.
Mm.
So it's been challenging sometimes to kind of force them to say, look, this is what it says. Because as soon as you, in some cases, when you give applicants an inch, they're going to try to take a mile, right? Sometimes not having that flexibility built into the ordinance is a good thing. And sometimes,
Yeah, the kind of the last thing I want is for us to go from a position of where we are saying, oh, in this situation that we didn't anticipate, here's where we think you should go with it, to every single site plan is open to, and they is open to interpretation, and as long as planning commission will let it go, we can do it. So I much rather would be at the place of there's some flexibility and we're here to mediate certain issues that are difficult they can't get around the language very well, rather than just, we've had way too many of these open-ended ordinances in the past.
Now, where it talked about it, the planning commission may require, I just found it, it was talking about the cladding or veneers, and I thought that was like what happened on Main Street.
That was the
And-
language that was making me pull my hair out trying to write it, because there is no good way to write that.
No.
Which is why I'm saying, and this is just my personal opinion, I like the language I came up with on page, whatever it is, the subpart C language. I think that kind of lays out
Yeah,
a good design,
like that.
which can be used on industrial buildings. Because I think the board is comfortable with kind of these steel metal type
Mhm.
buildings, so long as there's visual variety.
Oh, yes.
Which I think that language does. But I was not comfortable with the language I came up with regarding the materials, the percentages, things like that. Where I think we probably want to look at this Layton Township, which I think does a good job of kind of laying what out, is permitted. I think the only problem we're going to have is, I think you guys want to allow these fully metal buildings as long as there's visual variety. Under the Layton Township ordinance, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's basically saying you have to have, brick, stone, fluted block, glass, or similar decorative materials, which is not, at least what I thought the direction we were going in was.
It's maybe a little more prohibitive than what we were looking for the industrial. Not a lot, but maybe a little more. We didn't intend to make this, you have to build any kind of Taj Mahal here. But we also wanted to designate that here is an area that has had some attention paid to it to try to make it look pleasing to the eye. But I have another question, because this keeps coming up, and I think it's going to come up more and more. I'm seeing more and more of these buildings that, and I don't know exactly what they're built out of, but it's more modern. Their cladding looks like steel panels of some sort, but it doesn't look anything like a pole barn steel. It looks like it's more blocky, more modular. Is there a name for that type of construction? I'm seeing a lot of it happening down in Grand Rapids and around Cascade.
Can you give us an address or?
I didn't think of it before I came into the meeting, but every time I see these, we don't want a steel building, or we don't want steel in this way. And we're interpreting it as a pole barn steel versus what some of this new modular type of construction that looks very 2020 or beyond.
Like the panels, big panels.
Yeah, we're definitely not talking about that. I'd kind of like to see a building with that stuff on it, but I don't know what the words for it are and how to differentiate between that and regular pole barn steel.
Are you talking about that stuff that they put on the building next to the cannery?
Might be, I don't know. I'd have to look at it again.
No, that's like
Is that different?
siding.
Okay.
Sorry.
Something else that I think might be helpful, especially with some of this, how it's written, is we can add, you have a graphic designer, you can drop a graphic that'll have a picture of a building and kind of have, arrows pointing to this section and that section, the entrance. Which also might help an applicant to visualize what the
Yeah.
intent of this language is.
That would be good. So I guess I'm comfortable with a lot of what Layton Township has. I'm comfortable with a lot of what you have in this other ordinance, and I think we could marry those together quite well, but it's just not there yet.
Yep. So the only thing I'm a little concerned about is in the language I put together on page 21, so parts 3 and 4. Industrial building facades shall generally use high-quality building materials such as brick, wood, native stone, decorative concrete blocks, stucco, dry-vit, prefabricated corrosion-resistant metal panels, minimum gauge 26, etc. So I'm naming all these things that we would allow and permit, which is definitely going to conflict with the language.
Right.
of the township. Same thing with 4, that we wanted to see certain materials be of a higher quality to prevent them from being hit by corrosion, be more dent resistant. So we may have to drop that language, which again, I'm fine with. I think my language is better for the architectural standards we're looking for. His language is better for maybe the materials. So just be aware that, 3 and 4 might get dropped in favor of the Lake Township ordinance.
Yeah, they also have approved by the planning commission.
You mean the site plans?
Any of that material can be approved by the planning commission.
Item 3, yeah.
Under the language that's been.
You know, if there's something come up, it can be brought to us and we can approve or not. Otherwise, if it's not in there and they want to go against it, there's a ZBA.
So
Sorry.
are you getting what you need from us, or are we just making it more confusing?
Yeah, no, I'm just looking at the language on the Layton Township. It says, in recognition of developing technologies in building materials, planning commission may approve other materials in consideration of the following standards. Just following the standards. So that does give us some good language to use. But Mr. Conley, as you've indicated, we don't want to do this game of every single time.
Right.
But that's kind of what your job is.
Well, again, that's where I think perhaps if we take some of the specificity that's in your list and marry it into the general structure, of what's in the Layton Township list, we could kind of beef up the specificity here so we have less room to wiggle while still having the ability to move around and not paint ourselves into a corner here.
I think under these 4 standards in the Layton Township ordinance, if you're looking at thinking it might make sense to add something that would have the planning commission consider whether or not that developing technology or alternative material, sort of actually furthers the overall intent of the section, that we can write just a couple of sections of like a pertinent intent statement that says we are intending to have design standards so that we can create a active industrial parks that are fit in with the city's character and so on. Something like that, so we can really sort of dial in to what the intent is, because relied on this a few times when they come up with something that technically does not meet the standard of the ordinance, but everyone agrees, including us, it's going to look really, really good.
Right.
Everyone's like, I'm good with that because we've kind of made that good faith effort to do something that's interesting and unique and fits in and looks modern.
Yeah.
That's what we're going for here, so we might be able to state that more explicitly if we have language.
Yeah, in a word, I mean, here's our minimum standards. And if you've got something else, impress us,
Yeah.
and if we, as long as our language is flexible enough to incorporate that, great. I don't claim to know how to do that, but
So one thing I think we do need to discuss very briefly before we try to take a whack at it and bring something back to you is I was operating under the previous assumption that metal panels, similar to pole barn steel, was something that you would be willing to allow an industrial user to use.
yes.
That is not something that, correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Moore, doesn't appear to be something that's strictly permissible under the Layton Township standards. It's not a named substance. Brick, stone, fluted block, glass, or similar decorative material.
Only on the street side there. So in Layton Township, the entire building can be steel, but that portion that faces the street has to have a facade that's more neat than just the steel box of the door. So Layton Township, they don't really care what the sides look like. They don't care what the back looks like. They just want the front to be inviting and appealing and attractive. Intended to do. We required the entire building to have some kind of a facade on it, we would get every single applicant. Way too expensive and everything else, but by having a more limited application to just the portion that faces the street, or sometimes it's the street and a portion of it, visitor parking, something like that. That's fairly workable.
So I guess that's what I'm asking then is, you guys want to allow the entire building to be this pole barns type steel? Or would you be more comfortable with something like Mr. Moore elucidated, which is, the areas that adjoin a street have to use one of these other materials?
I like that idea.
More attractive.
I like that idea of it joining a street, making it more attractive. It can be steel, but like what he was talking about.
Mainly entrance, I would think, because theoretically, you could have a building with a street on
Oh, that's true.
three sides. But, and ultimately, the entrance and the parking entrance would be required to have a facade type improvement other than just pole barn steel or what we call construction steel. Our fire barn is that way, the old fire station.
Let's be honest, they choose pole barn steel because it's cheap. They want something where they can put their equipment, a lot of it, construction contractors, some of excavators, they just want a place to keep their trucks. So they just want the cheapest material they can put together to accomplish that, and that's fine.
Yeah.
And so when we've had instances where somebody has a really, really large building, it's 60,000 square feet or something like that. That's where the cost thing becomes a significant issue. It's gonna put, 60 semi trucks in there. If my building is 250 feet long, if I put brick on this, the whole project is not gonna work.
Somewhere else.
Build it instead, and so that's where we've had to exercise.
Yeah, I was starting to become concerned about that myself. If you happen to have a property that, where the building has its long end facing the street, we could have just this huge expanse that we'd be expecting them to prettify.
You could limit this type of facade to the main entrance area. Like the language about the scrolling between things. So the building entrance shall be clearly defined and recessed, framed, sheltering element, blah, blah, blah. You could limit the alternative materials to that section.
Yeah.
So if you go down to West Street and you look at the
Wolverine
Pack
building.
building,
Mhm.
the new addition that they put on is brick and it's beautiful and it's very nice. Whereas the rest of it, even the part that fronts along West Street, is pole barn steel. And I think, that's sufficient. That if you are a human element and a human size approaching the customer entrance side, you are at least enjoying that aspect of it not being pole barn steel. But if you're a semi truck driver and you're just there to pick up a whatever, you don't really care what it looks like so much.
No.
So some focal area, depending on the way their building is oriented, as long as they're generally the main
Business
entrance
entrance.
or business entrance, yeah.
And we do still have the ability to protect the rest of the building from being slab sided, but with this language about base body cap and, it's got to be X number of feet above the ground or percentage, if you want to go percentages, where it has to be a different material, a different color, a different something to create some kind of visual appeal, even if it is all pole barn steel. So I think there's been a few places where that's been pulled off and it looks nice. But maybe just limit these other higher quality, more expensive materials to the building entrance.
That would work, yeah.
So I have a question for Mr. Moore. On the side, like, let's say that you have a 250, 300 foot side that is not the entrance side. Is there a way that we could put in something about adding extra landscaping instead of, so not making, you don't have to add the brick, but how about add a few extra trees or something?
Yeah, and I think that's where some of the language that Mr. Womack could get help with. Even sometimes we just need to differentiate between colors. So sometimes if there's a long side, it's not a huge cost variation in colors, as I understand it. So that's usually workable. That combined with Burns landscape landscaping.
Okay.
fencing, and some other things. I mean, landscaping is expensive. I think that's a reasonable, as long as they're planting something that has enough height to it to make a difference. Just saying, yeah, we'll plant this, bush that's that tall, and then we're going, okay, well. Yeah, we can add something that'll.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds good too.
So is that help, or you have a direction to move with then?
Yep, so I'm not in a rush on this one. Obviously, we're working on see, this is so old, it's still section 40. Since we're working on the pool thing for a public hearing at the next meeting, we'll have enough on our hands. Might want to table this, let us work on another draft, come back and guys, give you more language, a little bit
yeah.
simpler, instead of throwing all this stuff at you.
Mhm.
So we have less to talk about it, that
Yes.
kind of hone it down.
Okay. I'd like to make that motion to table it. I can do it.
Sure, make a motion to table
Till next month.
10B.
the 10B.
There we go.
Okay,
It's item 10B that we're on. So
Okay.
if you just wanted to
there we
table
go.
that.
Making a motion to table item 10B. And yeah, there we go.
Any other discussion? All in favor of tabling this, please signify with aye.
Aye.
Aye. All in favor or all opposed? And the motion carries. Item C, parking requirements.
So I know getting into these fine points of ordinances is what you guys love to do. So I didn't want to spend a ton of time on this, but I did want to kind of put these ordinances in the same place so you guys kind of know what we're working with regarding minimum parking requirements.
Mhm.
This board has shown a distaste and appropriate distaste, I think, for the minimum parking requirements that we've had to work with. So part of it is we have the minimum parking requirements. And I don't know if Mr. Moore has a good methodology of kind of getting rid of those. Or maybe we beef up the language that gives the planning commission the authority to use those requirements as more of a guideline. But they would maintain the kind of final say in what the minimal standards would be. So I think Mr. Johnson was using 32.616 subpart B, subpart 1. The planning commission shall determine the minimum number of spaces required for accessory off-street parking by applying the parking design standards. Schedule parking requirements for the various uses and any other applicable provisions of this chapter. I think that's what he was using and relying upon to say, well, the planning commission has the authority to modify these things. It's not great language.
Mhm.
It really kind of sounds to an educated ear like, yeah, you get to determine it, but you get to determine it by applying the standards.
Right.
So you really should be using the standards. So I'm sure Mr. Moore has some great alternative language he can use there. But then the more penultimate question, I think, is do we want to kind of do away with section 32.617, the parking standards? Now, I've looked at some of the surrounding communities, hoping that maybe somebody just, had a real simple thing that says, oh, it's whatever the hell they want. Couldn't find one.
Mhm.
They almost all universally have some form of this, where they say, well, if you have a whatever, you're supposed to have X number of parking spaces. Besides the fact that, I don't know if we'd want to get rid of them. We do have people who come into town who say, well, I want to put in a whatever, and logically thinking you're going to have 30 or 40 cars parked there at all times, and they're going to say, well, I've only got enough space for 2 parking spaces, so that's all I'm going to provide. Well, I don't know if we want to just say, oh, well, the planning commission, some other planning commission in the future,
Mhm.
will just say, well, we're so pro-business, we're not going to require you to have parking spaces. Well, so now where are those people gonna park, right? So having a standard which you can go back to and rely upon, and then accept other information, similar to what we did with the Jimmy Johns, where they said, well, we've got 3 other stores, they only have 20 parking spaces, even though our ordinance required 43 or whatever. You could then, under an improved, the other ordinance, give the planning commission the greater flexibility to accept some alternative number, but use this ordinance as a base for discussion. Or do you have any thoughts on that?
What we had done in the last, actually the ordinance that we're wrapping up right now for another, this introductory language that we have in 32.617 that says parking space required by type of use shall be determined in accordance with the following schedule. We've modified that a little bit to say that the following schedule shall be utilized as a guide, to determine the number of parking spaces. And then we also have language that that enables the planning commission to adjust, to part either upwards or downwards from that standard based upon evidence from the applicant. So you can't just come in and say, yeah, 2 is going to be fine. 2 is going to be fine, then prove it. So should bring that, show us data, bring us something that says it's going to be X, because we can bring the data from the engineering manual and all that that shows you what the parking demand is likely to be based on studies, and it's a scientific organization. So if they want to vary from that, language that would require to prove why you need more or less. Usually they ask for less. I've had a couple that have looked at that standard, because so a lot of times they'll say, this is you shall have this many and you can't exceed it by more than 10%. And had one instance where somebody says, yeah, I'm going to be like twice what your ordinance. So being able to work through that process with the applicant, having that flexibility for us, it's been important to have something to go by. So that's why this table is helpful, although I agree that it's not usually helpful in a strict hard application. I mean, it's easy, but it doesn't make any sense sometimes.
Here might be a silly question, but you mentioned that there are engineering guides that recommend how much parking based upon studies and science and all that stuff, which I'm a big fan of. How do we know what we have here matches that?
We can check just by looking at your table. I mean, I looked at enough of these where most of them are pretty typical.
Okay.
So I don't, there's a few that are, that might be a little high in terms of how much parking it requires. And the guides, the engineering manuals don't give you perfectly simplistic, because you have to take into account when the data was collected, what time of day it was, whether it was a day or a weekend, a Saturday or a Sunday, whether it was an urban location or a suburban location or rural.
Whether it was a full moon, what temperature it was.
Yeah, pretty much. And so there's all these factors, and you kind of come up with something that you average all that together, and you look at the different applications. Sometimes there's only 1 or 2 examples. Sometimes they're not great, but it gets you something. It gets you in the ballpark so that you can have that conversation.
It sounds like with these 2 ordinances, we could fairly simply modify the language to just give you a little bit broader authority and flexibility. So, keep the guide, but say this is a guide, it's not a strict requirement. And then on the first ordinance, say, well, planning commission shall have the authority to determine, referencing the guide, and also taking in additional information as provided by the applicant or alternative learned treatises on parking standards. So if I could just move on for half a second, I did include the maximum parking ordinance. Now, we bumped up against this with the fireworks store. Now, I do actually like the language in here. I'm not sure we need to change it. Because under subpart B, it says, the planning commission shall determine that the parking is required based upon documented evidence. So, so by greater than 10%. Yeah, so I think that has the appropriate level of flexibility.
Mhm.
Obviously, Mr. Moore does this for a living, so do you have any suggestions on that? Bert?
No, I'm comfortable with the way this is.
And then the 622 deferred parking for commercial and industrial districts. We used this, and I can't remember which site plan it was we used it on. You guys recall? In the last couple of years, we've used this one as well. I'm not sure I love the language, especially subpart B. Parking may be deferred below the minimum standard of 0.5 per 1,000 gross floor area, blah, blah, blah. I think that's very limiting. I would prefer the language similar to part in the maximum parking, which is, you know, the planning commission can accept documented evidence as to why you're requesting deferred parking and by how much. So I'd like to eliminate maybe those specific numbers and change the language to give you more flexibility in that way. Now, you know, the applicant shall show the deferred portion on the site plan and recorded deed restrictions. That's all kind of necessary, so that's appropriate.
Mhm.
Same thing with subpart B. So I might just want to offer a change to subpart B to eliminate that and make it more flexible.
Oh, I have a question, and this is probably more for Mr. Moore, but if you've got something, Mr. Womack, that's great too. Are there communities that are using trading? Like if you might be 2 parking spots down, but if you put in bike racks or if you have electric charging station or something like that, you know, I'm not sure all of the goodies that we might want as to make the city better. But I'd be willing to look at items like that we could build into the parking.
Grand Haven does that. They have language in there that states that you have reduce your parking demand by 5 spaces or something if you provide a bike lot or a bike rack.
Mhm.
And a couple other places. I'm an advocate of deferred parking, which is here. You generally advocate shared parking. Often have language. I'm not sure if you guys do language that, especially in the downtown, like at Lowell, we added language that allows any use in the downtown to count any on or off street public parking within 400 feet towards your minimum parking requirement. So
Mhm.
downtown businesses have parking. So
We have that here.
so we often approach this stuff with just under the impression of we do want to minimize the amount of if we can work out shared parking arrangements, we'll do that with properties or if it's we show that, you know, this it's a bank and a restaurant. The bank is busy in the day, the restaurant's busy at night, so you can combine and reduce your overall parking spaces by your combined space total by 60 or 70%, then let's do that. So yeah, I think if we're going to incentivize some of that stuff, we'll have to be make sure that we're keeping it to the topic. So parking. So probably couldn't say that if you add some extra landscaping will create.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
That, but we're talking about electric vehicle spots.
We have the 2 major trails in this town as well. And for me, it just seems logical that if you could somehow provide better access to one of those trails via your property, then we could drop a couple parking spots because that would make it an easier way for people to make it to your. Yeah. So, I mean, I think it gives us some flexibility to dangle some carrots out there for things that we might like anyway and reduce the amount of parking that's happening.
For bicycles alone.
Did we not do that for like Jimmy John's? Cause I thought we did something about the bike rack
I think, yeah, I
because,
think we did.
yeah,
I think-
and we put it in there because we were like, if you'll put a bike rack in. So I thought we were already working on that.
I don't know if it was in the language or if we just kind of like offered it as a,
I'd have to go back and look.
We offered it.
Final
The
approval.
big problem was that they needed permission from Farm and Home.
Yeah.
For additional spaces, and Farm and Home wouldn't give them up. They would lose their minimum required
So
spaces.
there is some actually interesting development there, which is not ripe for the board, but I could talk about it during my city manager comments. if you'd like.
sure.
Sure.
Anything more you need from us on parking?
No, I think we have some good direction from the board about how we could address specifically the kind of flexibility language. Just have to get back to you guys, and then the zoning ordinance will eventually have to move forward.
Okay. I guess then, since it's just discussion, I don't think we need to table anything. We'll just bring it back up when it's next.
Complete.
Next item is D, a motion to recommend approval of the drainage easement for the White Pine Trails neighborhood, as described in Exhibit A.
I apologize. I know that you guys don't get a lot of information on these types of things, but they are related to the White Pine Trails neighborhood, which is the old Selma Tree Farm. Essentially, the developer, because I think you've had this on your agenda in the last couple of months,
Mhm.
put together a package of easements, assessment agreements, et cetera, so that at some point after they're done developing this property, the city will now take over those as public utilities. And also have the authority to impose the costs of any fixes necessary back onto the neighborhood itself. So this is for storm drainage easements. See the exhibit, although it's not, it's clear as mud.
Right.
But I feel confident in what's being proposed. That's the recommendation of the city council.
Any problems or questions with that? I'll make that motion then. Make motion to recommend approval of the drainage easement for the White Pine Trails neighborhood as described in Exhibit A.
I'll second.
Further discussion? All in favor, please signify by aye.
Aye.
Aye, all opposed? Motion carries. Okay, we're on to item 11. Open discussion for issues not on the agenda. Correspondence time. Get letters.
So I brought back the 270 West Street development permit extension. Did have to work out some final details regarding ADA parking at that location. Otherwise, we extended it another year. And then you see the other agreements that we've recently dealt with, which kind of create this whole package of White Pine Trails, maintenance agreements. Complex stuff.
Okay. Yeah, you got the good mouth.
Yeah, I got the loud one.
Okay, then,
Let me get you a quieter mouse.
I normally have that mouse. It makes me feel like I'm doing something. So, item B, staff comments, city manager.
With the exercise, kind of like the 12-ounce curl.
Oh, you got it.
Yes, so I was recently contacted, these developers, man, sometimes. Recently contacted regarding that specific property, the Jimmy John's and Skymint property. I heard that Jimmy John's may have withdrawn from that building, which is good or bad. But Skymint wanted to take over the entire building.
Oh.
Now, from a perspective of, the site plan, it's approved with the parking spaces the way it is, blah, blah, blah. I could see that as being a minor site plan change, and I could approve of that theoretically on my own authority. However, Skymint, which is a marijuana business, said, well, it was already approved of as a drive-through. And at least according to them, I have not independently researched this. Apparently, the state of Michigan has recently approved of marijuana drive-through businesses. Now, it's my understanding that as a special land use, drive-throughs are specific to the individual business and not as a general drive-through. So I told them that if that was their desire and intention, that we might have to hold another public hearing on that specific special land use for the drive-through for the marijuana business. So if they want to eliminate the drive-through, I think it's a minor site plan change. I could do that on my own. If they want to use the drive-through, we'd probably require that they come back to this board for special land use approval. I think there was a third alternative, but I can't think of it off the top of my head.
There was a lot of discussion on that drive-through, and it's pretty much for the sandwich shop, not the marijuana delivery or pickup.
Which is why I'm saying, well, and for good logical reason too. For anybody who's ever been on Alpine, on the west side of Alpine, there's a Starbucks. And if you go there at the wrong time of day, that line is out onto the road, Alpine, which causes horrible traffic jams. Part of the discussion this board had regarding even the Jimmy John's was the stacking distance. I think there's only sufficient space for 3 or 4 cars before you start blocking in handicapped and parking,
front.
right? So I don't know what the delivery time on a marijuana order would be. But if it's long enough that people are stacking more than 4 cars, it might not be appropriate to allow that use in that configuration.
Yeah, I would think it would take more than it would to make a sandwich.
My problem is identification. I mean, when you're able to walk into a business, you're able to actually see the person, see the ID, actually look. But if you're doing a drive-through, seeing outside the window, now you got to see the ID. A, that's going to take longer, and B, that doesn't seem as safe. And we've already had these discussions with another business, and so that.
So
Across the road.
you know that the state of Michigan allows curbside delivery of marijuana. Now that is somebody who walks up to your window, looks inside, sees you. I agree to a certain extent, the drive-through, especially at night, might make identification difficult, but that's not really something for us to determine. I think there are other appropriate things for the city to make determinations regarding drive-throughs. Whether it's legally permissible at the state or not, I think we have our own things that we can judge whether this is an appropriate use.
Yeah.
I mean, so, you know, Jimmy John's, let's say it takes a minute to make a stop, right? And they have 4 people per minute who want to get in the line, whatever. You can calculate the stacking distance. If a marijuana business comes in and says, well, it takes 5 minutes for somebody to order and get a delivery, now I don't think it's appropriate to allow them to use a drive-through, right?
That's our point. It's gonna take longer to do a drive-through for a marijuana.
Yeah.
This would be one of those situations where documented evidence would be quite helpful.
Right.
And
We
very
don't-
difficult to come up with.
Yeah, there's no.
Well, and I guess in my mind, it's, well, when you can give me the documented evidence, then that's when we will consider it.
I remember the third option. The third option was you could build the building as it is, because it's been approved as a.
Right.
drive-through. But if you're not going to have the Jimmy John's utilizing the drive-through as was, approved, you could build the building with it, but you can't use it.
Yeah.
Now that preserves the opportunity for them at some point in the future, to come back and say, well, the building has a drive-through. We could either move some other tenant in there, or
Bring
the
Jimmy John's.
marijuana business now have the evidence to present to you to show that it
okay.
is usable and safe and whatever.
Very true.
Now, I guess in this, and then I don't mean to make this meeting go longer because I'd like to wrap it up, but as long as we have this question here, if in this situation, another business comes in, it's not a Jimmy John's, it's not a marijuana place, we put the second place in there, and it's one of the places that takes a little bit longer, and we think there might be a stacking issue. Do we get a second bite of the apple when that new business comes in to take over that existing drive-through?
So interestingly enough, we'll be talking about that in about 30 seconds, but my position would be special land uses, which is what all drive-throughs are in this community, are individual to each business.
Yes.
So any business that wants to come in and utilize some kind of drive-through, whether it's pre-existing or not, has to come to this board for a special land use.
Okay. Just want to make sure.
So, a follow-up. So the Jimmy John's decided to vacate that building, and they have now proposed going into the old In Tandem Credit Union Bank, which is on the south.
Next to Jets in that mall.
side of
Yeah.
the strip mall there.
Yeah.
The problem is, and I'm not sure this would have been approved now, I don't know what the approval standards were back in the day, but there is an ATM and a drive-through window, causes all sorts of vehicular conflict. And you have the drive-through for the Big B. You also have the exit onto White Creek. And they try to use that as a 3-lane drive there. It's really only designed for 2 lanes. It's about 30-foot wide. Lanes are 12 feet wide. So Jimmy John's came to me and said, well, we'd like to use this as drive. I said, I think you're gonna have problems. Obviously, I don't speak for this board, but they would have to come to you and prove that they could do that safely. And I told them just my initial thoughts. Now, I forget what they call it. So over at, is it a CVS or a Rite Aid on 17? There is a raised concrete barrier which prevents people from exiting and making a left-hand turn.
Yes.
Pork chop, ham.
Mr.
So-
Avatini.
It is possible to, I'm just speaking here, to have a drive-through at that in Tandem Bank location and then force people to make the left-hand turn to go all the way back around the building. That way you're preventing the conflict of trying to make a hard right-hand turn out onto White Creek with opposing traffic coming in the other way.
Not that bad.
Also, you might want to consider making it both lanes one way going to the north at that location.
Yes.
Now you don't have conflicting traffic going this way as well.
Are people going south on that?
I've seen people go south through there.
I go north out of there, so.
Yeah,
we're
that's
over there
not a-
all the time.
And
Okay.
Part of your job is to prevent vehicular conflicts, and there are some potential issues at that location. If they do want to pursue it, I welcome them to come back with a draft plan to me, and then obviously we'll come to you guys for special land use approval.
Sounds good.
But that is all I have for right now. Thank you.
Any comments? Thank you. Plan commission members.
I lost track of time tonight and I went back in to look in my computer to say, do we have a meeting tonight? And I just got logged in and the phone rang and I went, yeah, we do.
I should have came over.
I looked over there, I couldn't see your truck and I went, ooh, that's a bad sign.
Should have came over.
Sorry
Anyone
for
else?
being late.
I have a question for Mike. Do I have an unexcused for last month?
Oh, yeah, we, at the last month's meeting, we didn't know he was not coming, but he had sent me an email before the meeting started, that I just didn't see it.
So, and Mr. Johnson, correct me if I'm wrong, but, you know, I think this board is the one that figures out for itself whether members are excused or not. I don't know if there's any written standards to that effect.
Okay.
So the board could, you know, post hoc determine that you were excused. They could change something. And I don't remember, did you guys excuse him at the previous meeting?
We didn't know what his, we didn't take a specific action, no.
No. we didn't
I also
take it.
don't know, does that affect them getting paid? Is it a per meeting type deal?
Oh, I don't get paid.
Oh, okay, I didn't know, because we do offer pay for the.
I know.
Generally, if there is an excuse present, the board will accept it. They then have the option to have that person's
Oh, yeah.
reason.
Right.
You can excuse them. It's really at the board's discretion.
Okay.
If there is no motion made to specifically excuse them and they've not provided a reason to be, it's generally excused as.
Okay.
But I would reiterate that because it's the board's decision, and we didn't do it at this meeting, for the last meeting, you could theoretically at the next meeting say, hey, you know what, we've come to information about 2 meetings ago about here's what happened, just throwing it out there.
The only problem I would say with that is that it would mess our minutes up terribly.
Yeah.
So, like in an instance with Mr. Merlin tonight.
Yeah.
He was not excused by the board. He did not provide a reason to be excused that we are aware of. So when I do the minutes, he would be absent.
So, would it be helpful then if right at the roll call, I offer to, because I haven't put that out there for people before.
If the board feels it necessary to do that, you could.
And starting with the next meeting, I'll try to remember. And if I forget, please remind me and we'll excuse people
Oh.
officially so they can be reflected in the meetings.
Okay. Okay.
Because and all the time I'm doing this, we haven't done that because I haven't paid attention to it.
Okay.
And I wanted you to get demerits and suspension or whatever it is you get from an excuse.
Can I get out?
You can't go to recess. So
Bylaws might have some guidance on that too. Often addressed.
When you gotta miss before you get kicked off.
What the bylaws
Well, I'm
say.
pretty sure that of the members of the board, there's punishment, it's just at home.
Okay.
any other planning commission? Okay. Report of the city council representative.
Hey, me no more.
Oh,
Yeah,
I'm
this-
looking at you.
We don't,
still.
we don't have one unless,
Thanks, you guys. You do a great job. It's always a pleasure to sit and watch you guys struggle.
yeah,
Mr. Conley, for what it's worth, I believe Miss Atchison might be appointed to this board on a temporary basis soon, so she can serve. As
Okay.
council representative.
Hmm.
and then report of the planning consultant. Well, in that case, we're adjourned.
Thank you.